Hello, Unmasked Agenda listeners. You are, tuning into another pre recorded interview with your friendly neighborhood agitator, Cliff Cawthon. And I am happy to have 43rd LD candidate and also a good friend of mine and labor activist, Hannah Sabio-Howell, join us in, my virtual lair. Thank you very much, Hannah, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat.
Awesome. So for viewers, for the last couple of weeks, we've been airing our May Day special, and I know some people probably miss me being in the usual location down in our studio in Columbia City Theater. I assure you, for our next show, I will try to be down there. But for now, yeah, we're having these really interesting conversations with folks, and so many of you know I ran for office previously, Kent City Council. It is not an easy gig. So I am honored and I'm appreciative that, Hannah, you could take time out of your busy schedule to run. And it is a gauntlet. So why don't we just start from the top? And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to run for the 43rd state Senate seat?
Gladly. Well, thank you again so much for having me. I'm really excited to get to talk more about our vision for an affordable Washington. And that is ultimately what our campaign is about. Most of us are struggling to afford life here in Washington state because of decades of corporate friendly leadership that has failed to prepare Washington for the affordability crisis. But I really believe that this could be the best place in the nation for us to build good lives. And it's going to start by addressing the crisis of affordability with the urgency it deserves. That to me means making housing abundant and affordable by reducing rent and putting homeownership within reach by building more housing. To me, it looks like winning a universal childcare program to lift families out of struggle so that they are no longer carrying the full weight of the cost of raising a family here alone. It also looks like fully investing in the teachers and the students in our K 12, our pre K 12, and our higher education system, and not only restoring the cuts that have been made over the course of the last several years, but building those out further. Um, and of course, in today's day and age, as the federal government becomes fascist, authoritarian, and actively divests from and attacks states like ours, we also need to be protecting immigrant and trans community members' safety and opportunity. And to me, all of that relies on the state legislature having the political courage to tax the ultra wealthy in our state, to invest in our safety net and relieve the cost burden on working people. And this is the most progressive district in the state that I'm running to represent, the 43rd district. And as a renter myself, as someone who comes out of the labor organizing movement, as someone who used to work at the state legislature for many years, I think that ours is a campaign that is ready to represent a new generation of leadership, a new generation of fighter who can tackle these problems, not only because we know them and have organized alongside workers to address them, but because we feel them too. So that's a little bit about our campaign's mission and vision, and I'm excited to dig into the specifics of all of that with you more.
Excellent. Wow. So first of all, congratulations on that being really concise and also being very poignant. Like the whole time you were talking, I was just thinking about the theme of affordability and how each part of your platform really nails a lot of the key hurdles and challenges people are facing right now just to be able to live. And also, I'm, thinking about the some of the naysayers that I've heard less and less of these days. That back, I want to say, in the last several years, that you've had naysayers say, "Oh, well, if you're having trouble paying your bills, just do this," or, if you're, why are all of you young people whining? If and you stop buying avocado toast, right? And now it feels like there's this consensus that, oh wow, actually the system is really making life unaffordable and just difficult for working people. I'm wondering, have you noticed that shift, and If so, what do you think is behind that shift in consciousness?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think more and more people are looking around and saying, I shouldn't have to work this hard for things to still feel this hard. I shouldn't have to work more than one job for the life I want to build, the family I want to be able to provide for, the rest or vacation I want to be able to have, the healthcare I want to be able to have.
Right.
And so, what is becoming increasingly clear, I think, particularly in states like ours, in cities like Seattle and states like Washington,
Yeah.
the deck has really been stacked against working people by corporate special interests that get richer and richer while the rest of us struggle more and more. We pay more even as our services, our schools, our higher education system, our healthcare, our childcare support erodes. And to me, I think that not only do we have concrete evidence that the wealth is here, but it's the job of the state legislature and policymakers at all levels of government, really, but the state legislature especially owes working people here a fair economy, and that's going to require taxing the ultra wealthy to invest in our services that we all need and rely on, and reducing costs for working people.
So, excellent. So, one of the things you mentioned is that you have experience working in the legislature as well as with, with nonprofits, and the 43rd rather well. It sounds like, and you also know Olympia, and if you're elected, you're going to represent that district, which is one of the most liberal and also socialist leaning districts in the state, in Olympia, where you're going to be working with folks from Yelm, and you're going to be working with folks from Spokane and Colville, and Snohomish County, and all the way down to Vancouver. And also in a lot of those places, they don't have the high level of they're very dissimilar from the 43rd. In the needs of people in this district, so which both of us are seeing in right now. So I'm wondering what if you could maybe explain some of your high level plans on both how to address housing specifically, and also how you'll be able to move the needle with those lawmakers that live in places and that come from constituencies that might be a bit more than a bit up just a bit dissimilar to the folks we have here in the 43rd.
Yeah, I love this question. And I'm actually going to take the second part of it first, just because it gives me an opportunity to give some foundational background information about who I am and why I'm in Washington in the first place. I actually have, on my dad's side of the family, generations of educators and farmers in Eastern Washington that make up that side of the family. And I lived in Spokane for 4 years because I went to college in Spokane at Whitworth University, in part to be near my family that lived in Spokane, Ritzville, and Walla Walla, and still does. And so I still consider Eastern Washington home in so many ways, and care for the communities that have really shaped my family very, very deeply. And I think you're right that the best type of policy that is going to make life across the state of Washington more affordable and more fair for all of us will, of course, include strong relationships and coalition building across the state, including with people in parts of Washington, or communities in parts of Washington, districts in parts of Washington that are not as progressive as the 43rd, which is the most progressive district in the state. And to zero in on now the first part of your question around housing, I think that the crisis of housing affordability, while felt most acutely here in the 43rd district and Seattle more generally, absolutely has ripple effects across the rest of the state as working people get pushed further and further out of the 43rd district and out of Seattle. They move to other parts of the surrounding suburbs, the larger Seattle metro area, but then even further. And this is something that we hear affecting the overall cost of living, and especially the cost of housing in every corner of our state. So one of the things that I think the state legislature really needs to act with urgency on is regulatory reform, permitting reform, and financing reform. So tackling in these different ways, using every tool in the tool belt to make sure that bureaucratic red tape is not slowing down the building of housing while costs balloon, that
Hmm.
it is, easier for counties and cities to build more density, more upwards, and that it's possible for these projects to get the capital they need to get off the ground. I think the state legislature has a role to play in incentivizing upzoning. I think that we absolutely need to continue to invest in our housing trust fund. That's something that the state legislature has had an eye toward, but I think needs to reach further on. And then something I really, something I want to underscore, and this is I think, a distinction between myself and my opponent. I think that the state legislature has a role to play in supporting municipal social housing programs like Seattle's
Hmm.
social housing developer. I think it's important to
Hmm.
note that over 60% of the 43rd district in 2023 approved the initiative to
Hmm.
establish, a social housing developer. But then by over 65% of us approved Prop 1A, the funding mechanism that is effectively a tax on the rich, a high earners payroll tax, to pay for social housing, which to me says that an
Hmm.
overwhelming majority of the 43rd district believes in making more housing more affordable for more people and balancing our tax code, asking the wealthiest people and corporations in our state to pay for that. So I think the state legislature, and something I would be excited to champion as a state legislator if I have the honor of being one, is really making it possible for more municipal social housing programs to develop across the state, and for Seattle's as a model for what that can look
Hmm.
like to get all the support it needs from Olympia.
Absolutely, and just to add some extra commentary to the part about the social housing developer. Soon, the developer is going to announce its first acquisition, its first housing acquisition, which is really exciting. Some people know this, but I was on the board of the developer, and I've had my criticisms in the past of the developer, but I've worked with Tiffany McCoy in uh, in my previous roles in the advocacy space, and her leadership has been definitely like a step in a leap in the right direction. So I don't know about you, but I'm excited for the future of the social housing developer.
Me too. Me too. I was very excited to support it in the grassroots way that I could when it was initially a campaign, and I'm really excited to see more institutional support for the social housing developer come out of
Mhm.
the state legislature.
Absolutely. In fact, there's been a couple of bills already that have been edging their way into legislature in the last couple of sessions to get, state support for it. And yeah, it's a really interesting model. I mean, other cities, especially our big cities around Washington, I think, in a year we might see more social housing developers pop up. But before waxing philosophical and digressing too much on, our level of social housing, I wanted to, I wanted to talk a little bit about your opponent because, you have made, you've set some contrasts to your opponent in terms of both policy and also your approach to lawmaking. And I know in the Stranger, as well as other local commentators, have noted that Senator Pedersen has been criticized for being too moderate in his approach. Particularly, there's a very funny political cartoon in the South Seattle Emerald recently. Shout out to Brett Hamill for his commentary. It's always welcome. It is always a breath of fresh air where I can see his cartoons. But how Senator Peterson almost, not almost, but pro offers when he's calculating his next moves, that he is overly conciliatory to big business. That being a criticism. And I'm wondering if that is a criticism you share, and also if you can elaborate on some of the other ways that you contrast from your opponent, Senator Peterson.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I want to paint a picture of our district really quick to describe why I do think ultimately Senator Pedersen is out of step with our community. So, like I've mentioned, the 43rd district is the most progressive district in the state, and that's not a vibes-based claim. That is something that we have seen through the margins by which we have voted to tax the rich, the ways in which we have affirmed the capital gains tax, the Climate Commitment Act, the Long-Term Care Act, the Seattle Shield Initiative. The 43rd district approved all of those by huge margins. We also see it in the way that the 43rd has elected the more progressive candidate running against a corporate centrist. So people like Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink and Representative Sean Scott, two Working Families Party candidates that our campaign is really proud to be endorsed by. These are people who painted a vision of an affordable future that centers working people's interests. And that's what the 43rd district is hungry for. And this is also the district with, by far, compared to every other district in the state, the most renters. Nearly 75% of us are renters, including myself. So those are some of the things that underpin our assessment of a district that is currently represented and has been represented for the last 20 years by a more moderate Democrat. And I want to acknowledge the really important work that Senator Pedersen did to pave the path to and ultimately win marriage equality, to overcome Tim Eyman's tax initiatives that kept Washington's tax code in a very regressive place for so long. He's someone who I would be really proud to take the baton from, but it is time for him to pass the baton. I think that in seeing how he as a candidate is someone for whom over half of his campaign coffers right now are made up of corporate contributions and PAC spending, someone who baked a huge corporate tax break into the millionaire's income tax, someone who allowed a rollback of the estate tax, so a tax on the wealthiest households in Washington, is something he allowed to be rolled back this year. I think these are concessions to ultra wealthy individuals and corporations that we don't need to make, and that we certainly don't need to have the senator from the most progressive district overseeing.
Absolutely. And I mean, none of that was wrong. This district time and time again has voted overwhelmingly towards like progressive and left-leaning initiatives, and particularly one thing I forgot to note at the beginning of the show, and I should definitely note it now for transparency's sake. So you mentioned the Working Families Party, and as some people know, I've been a longtime member of the Working Families Party, and one of the people that helped set up the MLK County chapter of the party. So you are a Working Families Party endorsed candidate. I did have a role in that as one of the people that voted on to endorse you, on the endorsement. So obviously I'm in this capacity now, and I'm not speaking to you as a Working Families Party member, but I did want to note that for the record. And kind of moving and also in the future, if Senator Pedersen wants to come on, defend his record and explain to us why he deserves another term, then he is more than welcome. We invite him, and I believe I've already sent the email, but if I haven't, I will. So that being said, just a little coverage there for myself, but also, going back to what you were sharing with us, and I really appreciate you sharing, painting that picture. Just thinking about your record, there is, one thing that I do want to bring up, because you mentioned that you've worked in the legislature, you lived in Eastern Washington, you graduated from a university in Eastern Washington, you know how to work across the aisle. And, one of your previous mentors, Representative Larry Springer, was noted for being more of a centrist in his approach to lawmaking. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how does Senator Pedersen, given some of your criticisms and the way we've seen him move, how does he differ from Representative Springer in, some of the things that you learned from him as a legislative aide?
Let me start with some of the things I learned from Representative Springer, who is a dear mentor and just a wonderful person in my life, and taught me a few things, a few key things. That being a straight shooter, being clear about what will get you from a yes to a no or a no to a yes, and then working in good faith to create that path together. And understanding, I'll quote one of his favorite phrases, but understanding that your enemy today is your ally tomorrow, and your ally today could be your enemy tomorrow. These are some of the things that undergirded what I observed of his approach to leadership and his ability to be effective. When I was his legislative aide, I also was in charge of helping run the business roundtable that he oversaw as the House Democratic Caucus's official business liaison. And while again, there were many different ways in which my own politics would really diverge from what I heard in that room, what I understood the power of the roundtable to be is that it became a space for people to talk clearly and honestly and transparently about their concerns or their opposition or their support of policy together in one space, and to have a person who they could go to, who they could trust to convey that and move with them from there. That's some of what I learned from Representative Springer that I have worked to embody in my organizing, and is something that I really fundamentally believe is an important part of being an effective and trustworthy lawmaker. I think that, again, what I want to point to about how our campaign differs from that of the incumbent, and maybe more broadly that of a status quo or politics as usual approach to governing, is that we, in not taking corporate PAC money and in standing 10 toes down on the values of working people's interests, working people's priorities, and what a fair economy looks like, what common sense economic policy looks like, that is a set of non-negotiables that we're running to be a new generation of leadership where you know exactly where we stand and you can trust that we are going to the mat for those visionary progressive values that the 43rd district has affirmed over and over again. So I think that those are to button it up, that carrying the water for corporations is not something we will ever do.
Right on. I love that. And, I think that a lot of folks lose that nuance, and that lesson from Representative Springer is really important. Actually, it's something that I learned. It was affirmed in the last several years, but I learned early on, where it's like your enemy tomorrow could be your ally, or your enemy today could be your ally tomorrow, and your ally today could be your enemy tomorrow. A lot of people, I think, at least, lose sight of that, right? Especially those, when we're at the grassroots level and we're chanting and we got the energy pumping and we're feeling righteous indignation when this is not the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's no snap and suddenly all your enemies go away and you win the day and cue the outro music, right? No, we all have to live with each other after the session is done. These fights may often take years, and actually that does bring up a question, because your platform is very comprehensive, and we're going to get to your platform in a second. Particularly, I want to ask about one particular pillar of your platform, but what parts of your platform do you see as like multi-year struggles, or like that you're kind of sitting back and thinking about as like this is going to be a long-term project where I'm going to have to bring people with me and really organize around this goal?
That's a great question. And I would point to the fight for universal childcare. I think that
Mhm.
that is something that we can absolutely achieve in Washington state and are going to need to build the road toward brick by brick. And I think some of those bricks, what I would like to see, what I would like to fight for first, would
Yeah.
be an expansion of paid parental leave eligibility so that
Hmm.
for
Yeah.
parents who are currently ineligible for the support to stay home with and care for not only their new baby but themselves, their own bodies, in that precious year from 0 to 1, there could be more support for people who currently work at restaurants or are gig workers or are disabled, for all kinds of reasons people don't meet the eligibility threshold right now, and I would like to expand that. That would be step brick one. Brick two would be
Mhm.
establishing a home care benefit for new parents. So, effectively, a cash subsidy that
Mhm.
parents can use to seek the care they need for their, at that point, 1 to 3 year old. So, for toddlers, a part time
Right.
daycare or a nanny share. These are more flexible forms of childcare that we know that ease the transition back to work for a lot of working parents, and
Right.
it's currently exorbitantly expensive. So a cash subsidy in the form of a home care benefit is something I would like to fight for and establish here in Washington state. And then I really think that universal pre-K, so then taking that 3 to kindergarten period of time, is
Yes.
where we could build out effectively a childcare, a universal childcare for uh, parents in Washington state. So right now, parents shoulder alone the cost of raising a child from 0 to
Yep.
kindergarten, 0 to 5. And
Yeah.
that is a space where piece by piece, I think Washington state could pave the path to a comprehensive universal childcare program. And I would be really excited to fight for that as a measurable material part of delivering on affordability for Washington families.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. And we're currently at the 27-minute mark. So, to our listeners, you are tuning in the Unmasked Agenda here on Rainier Avenue Radio, and we are speaking with Ms. Hannah Sabio-Howell, for candidate for 43rd Legislative District State Senate seat. And we are going to be bringing you some messages from the station and from the community, and we will be right back. And put in the pause. Okay, cool. And now we are back, and we're listening, and you're listening to the Unmasked Agenda here on Rainier Avenue Radio. And thank you for joining us. We are here with Ms. Hannah Sabio-Howell, the candidate for the 43rd Legislative District State Senate seat. And she was just breaking down her plan for her multi-year plan and multi-phase plan for not just universal child care, but how to make being a parent affordable again here in the state of Washington. I, that sounded better in my head when I said it, so that came off a bit too mega coded. So I'm gonna reel that back, and I'm just gonna say let's make being a parent and raising a family universally affordable. Let's do that. I don't know the
Yeah.
acronym for that, but like, oh my God, you start to even invade our dreams. Ew. Anyway, enough of thinking about the orange skull in the other Washington. That's a problem that we can talk about another time. But I did want to zero in on the financial aspect of it because I just from listening to it, it sounds like your plan um, to reinforce support for child care services, to provide subsidy for new parents, and what was it? There's a third component. Can you remind me? It was
It's
reinforce.
Yeah, universal pre-K, I think, is the piece you're thinking of. So that
Yeah.
paid parental leave expansion, home care
Yeah,
benefit, universal pre-K. That would be
absolutely.
hot.
Yeah, that very comprehensive. I think that's a great idea. The question I have though is, I mean, I hate to say it because this is always what naysayers say, but how are you going to pay for it? Because right now we're looking at an operating budget deficit probably due to decreasing revenues and because the Orange Skull wants to is essentially um, trading federal funding for allegiance and loyalty. And I know none of us are ready to Zeke Heil to what in a way Trump wants, right? Well, at all, but still. Um, yeah, how are you going to square that circle when it comes to budget time? Because the last budget session was horrible, even with the passage of the millionaires tax.
That's a very fair question. For all the reasons that you named, the federal government is actively robbing the people of this country to line the pockets of
Mm.
billionaires. And that is coming at the cost of state level healthcare, childcare, higher education. So that's why I think it is so imperative that we have people in office who are going to be incredibly committed to every form of rebalancing our tax code by taxing the ultra wealthy individuals and corporations here in our state who truly have remarkable levels of wealth. I mean, I think that I want to point to a couple of examples, ways in which we know that Washington State is a place where we really could protect ourselves from cuts and
Mhm.
expand our ability to support working families. One is in the form of the margins by which the social housing developer pulled in revenue from the high earner payroll tax that funds it in its first reporting quarter. Uh, we saw revenue in excess of, well, but it, far outside of even our most optimistic projections. And the second example I want to point to really quick is the fight for 10 years ago was a fight won against the
Mhm.
narrative that,
Yeah.
taxes, or well, at the time, it was about raising the wage, but similar to the conversation we're having about raising taxes on the ultra wealthy, what we heard from large corporate employers was that this was going to tank the economy and everything would collapse. And instead, what we
Yep.
got out of the fight for 15 was a more fair living wage for more workers that allowed more people to spend money here to build lives here and created a more resilient and more robust economy. So I say those things just to point out that this is possible. When I then talk about things like the wealth tax, a corporate income tax, the Vibrant Cities Act, um, the millionaires tax, but uh, further, the millionaires tax, but more. I think these are things that we could do in Washington State that I would be excited to fight for. Oh, the Well Washington Fund, sponsored by Representative
Right.
Sean Scott. These are different forms of bringing down costs for working people by bringing up a tax rate for the ultra wealthy that is currently so far below what is anything close to fair. And that's how I
Mm.
see the 2027 legislative session and beyond grappling with our current funding crisis. It's really about taxing the ultra wealthy.
Yeah. What's interesting? One of the things I will say this. I was a little gleeful you brought up the Fight 15 because that if there is one thing that I think Seattle should be really proud of, it was that contribution to labor history, both in SeaTac and Seattle. And, when we did our little part in Tacoma and in South King County, like working on the Fight 15 was one of the highlights of, my professional life. But, I'm glad you bring that up because I remember. after we passed a $15 an hour minimum wage in Seattle. And then I think it was the week after, I was driving by, there used to be an Arby's in Soto, which closed during COVID. So it was not due to minimum wage. It closed around COVID. Um, and it advertises like now seeking help, now paying $20 an hour. And it stayed open for a long time, and seeing how immediately all of these major businesses shifted to using using an increased minimum wage as a selling point to get more employees, to really how many new restaurants opened and expanded, and despite all of that naysaying you brought up. So I'm glad that you brought that up, and that is contributing to your thinking. And also, something very interesting that you brought up was how we really should be talking about, who can pay, right? Because one of the things that is really fascinating, I think a lot of people don't really think about, is we actually have so many tax breaks for big corporations, for special interests in this state, that if we went through, and they done this the last couple of years in legislature, right? Where, I mean, I'm sure you probably have heard about it, but as part of in 2025, part of the biennial budgeting process, one of the points of that compromise was, let's go through and eliminate all of these useless tax breaks. Like there was a tax break on bars of gold and on gold. Like when I read that, I'm like, wait, what? Did someone just was this just in a corner, and it was one of those measures that was meant to benefit like Alaskan prospectors in in 1880, right, in like 1895, and it's like, hey, we're just gonna put this on the books, and then they forgot about it for almost 150 years, and then suddenly it's like, we are still giving a tax break for people who are trading in gold. Okay, we might want to eliminate that, but just useless things, right? Yeah. So in that case, let's expand that out a little bit and talk a bit about, because you name dropped the Washington Fund, that you really laid out how we should tax the rich. What are some other ways that you think we could possibly kind of set the budget right going, into 2027 legislative session?
Well, I do think not only do we need to use every tool in our tool belt for protecting funding and expanding funding for services that working people rely on, but I also want to zero in on some of the programs that we know not only work, but are actually vital parts of working people's ability to build good lives here that are otherwise subject to cuts this year, things that I want to really fight hard to protect. So that includes paid family and medical leave. Our Washington's PFML program is one of the best in the nation, something we should be really proud of, and is really at risk of underinvestment in the years ahead. And I think that can't be. We just know so many families across the state rely on that as a safety net that catches people where otherwise there would be none. I also think that, I mentioned earlier, there are some forms of progressive revenue policy ideas that sort of continue to get swept by the wayside, either because corporations threaten a lot of opposition to them, things like the wealth tax, or because I think, these are just ideas that haven't gotten enough airtime, like the Vibrant Cities Act, which is something that Tech for Taxes, an organization that I'm really proud to be endorsed by, has done a lot of good work to lead the conversation on. But there are different tools that, especially this past year, were sort of swept off the table to make way for the millionaire's income tax. And I think that shouldn't have happened because of the fact that the millionaire's income tax is not going to pay out for our state until 2029. And things like the Well Washington Fund or the wealth tax could have helped close that gap between now and then. And I'd like to see more urgency on that, and I would like to champion those things if I have the honor of being elected.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we definitely need to make sure we have you and other progressives at the airport when, because apparently, like, the rich are fleeing. I've heard this from the Seattle Times and all over some of the Reddit threads, and I've heard this kind of messaging coming from Como. So apparently we do need to have people at the airport to give the rich tax bill on the way out. Yeah. Apparently I don't know, is that really a thing? Actually I'm kind of curious what you make of that, because I know what I think about it, but I'm curious what's your perspective on that I guess economic flight threat?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I want to mention about work I've done in the past that informs how I interpret this narrative now. In 2024, I, at Working Washington, organized shoulder to shoulder with food delivery gig workers, people who deliver for DoorDash, Uber Eats, Instacart, Grubhub, because the city of Seattle, led by Council President Sarah Nelson, was working really hard and really frantically to roll back gig workers' minimum wage rights that had just recently been instated as of January of 2024. So workers finally won a minimum pay floor and some basic flexibility and transparency rights, consumers as well. And the corporations immediately lashed out with this narrative that this is going to sink their industry, that they simply cannot pay workers a minimum wage without imposing price gouging junk fees on customers in Seattle. But workers called their bluff. We called their bluff and we said, this is a story coming from the same corporations that have been making more and more year over year than any company in history. And now these corporations want us to believe that they can't afford to pay workers roughly 20 to 25 an hour after expenses. And lo and behold, I mean, recently a report just came out showing that not only are workers taking home more per order, the equivalent of roughly $20 an hour per order, are no longer as reliant on tips. Also, the city finally has access to data that the corporations were withholding, but orders are actually up. So the lie that corporations were feeding lawmakers that this was tanking their industry was not borne out by the data that proved that orders went up as pay went up and the industry is fine. So I talk about all that just to say that the movement I come out of calls corporations bluff and takes on big corporate interests and asserts that we are not going to settle for a race to the bottom here. And that applies to how we tax the ultra wealthy as well. I think one of the high profile stories that's been making the rounds is about Starbucks leaving, when Starbucks' own statement is that they are expanding. They are not closing down any operations here in Seattle. They are just opening a second headquarters. And the other thing I want to acknowledge the reality of the layoffs that we're seeing in tech right now broadly, from Meta, Amazon, T-Mobile, but every single one of those companies has made clear that these are AI-related changes in their industry, that they are laying off human workers because they're expanding into AI. that is obviously a problem, and it's a problem separate from tax policy. That we know that these taxes on the ultra wealthy, both individuals and corporations, are not why people decide to put down roots, people or corporations. Corporations pick where they are based on the talented and educated workforce they need. People pick where they live based on where their community is, where their access to healthcare is, where their kids' schools are. You know, these are the way in which we tax the ultra wealthy is not a determinative factor about the wealth present in our state. And the last thing I want to say is that Washington State is still a tax haven. You mentioned this earlier.
Yeah.
But Washington State, even with this small correction in the form of the millionaire's income tax, is still a place where, or I should say, is still one of the most regressive economies in the country. So the ultra wealthy are welcome to move, but they're going to be taxed at a higher rate everywhere else they go, except for Florida.
Right.
So yeah, those are some of the things I would say to push back on that narrative. And just again to say that the labor movement has always been the best at calling corporate interests bluff and
absolutely
winning anyway and delivering materially for working people.
And you know, it's funny, just as you're laying that out and providing all of these like data points, that it occurs to me that this entire narrative about capital flight is, for the most part, largely based on a "dude, trust me, bro," like a narrative that is based on the words and the spurless claims of the ultra wealthy and their backers, and particularly I find it funny that I was looking at a My Northwest op-ed the other day about which definitely progressive paper, right? Very progressive. I'm kidding. If anyone knows my Northwest, knows it's the exact opposite. But it was an op-ed, basically bemoaning how Mayor Katie Wilson was mean to Starbucks. Now they're leaving. This is just part of a pattern where Seattle is so mean to businesses and Washington's being mean. And it was so unscientific. It was citing nothing except based on all of these fees and taxes that you have, and it brings down the morale of hardworking CEOs and people in that company, and look, they're laying people off. Yet at the same time, like you said, their own statements denote that they're not leaving, they're expanding. And these layoffs are largely due to AI, which is a whole other thing entirely. And one of the reasons that I hope that people actually organize in their workplaces and unionize in greater numbers in the 21st century. But I digress. I just really appreciate how you've shared that with us. So let's kind of building on what you shared with us already. You work for Working Washington. You've been a huge advocate for workers and workers' rights activists in your own right. So can you share and elaborate a little bit more on how on what areas of your platform are going to make life easier for working people? Because we talked about housing, we talked about childcare, we talked about progressive taxation. What else should folks know?
Yeah, well, I want to talk about some of the things that we know are part of building an affordable life here, which includes making sure that our statewide minimum wage is keeping up with the cost of housing, the cost of living, costs of everything. And right now, I mean, citing just some data from Seattle and King County, minimum wage workers have to work well over 60, sometimes in the range of 80 hours a week to afford an average one bedroom in the region. And I think that not only do we need to focus on building more housing stock to bring costs down, which we've seen be effective in cities like Austin and Jersey City, but we also have to make sure wages are keeping up. I think it's kind of a 1-2 punch to ensure that people are both making enough money to live good lives here and not having to immediately spend all of that money on rent or childcare. I also think that we really need to invest in some of the programs that remove costs from people's path to education. So the Washington College Grant is something that has been on the chopping block for cuts now for a little while and will continue to be. And I think that's one of the many different levers we know the state legislature can pull to ensure more people can access pathways to higher education. It's also going to require further investments in building out our career and technical college system and and apprenticeship programs, other pathways to work that aren't exclusively reliant on a 4-year college education. So those are just a few things. I mean, I'm thinking about these other sets of things that contribute to an affordable life and a full array of opportunities that are oftentimes closed off to people in our state just because of cost.
Absolutely. So we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask you a hard question, and then let's send you off on an easier question. So let's talk about ICE because yeah, right. It's like, save this for the end, Cliff. Really. But yeah, like it's not a secret that we've seen increased ICE activity outside of Seattle because they're cowards and they know, if they were to do their dirt in broad daylight in Seattle, there'd probably be at least a flash mob of 50 people, right, to protest them. That being said, there has been an increase in ICE activity overall in Washington State. The federal government has explicitly said that they are going to ramp up activity and essentially try to invade Washington and other blue states and blue cities like Seattle. Even after what happened in Minneapolis, St. Paul, I'm wondering what steps do you want to take that the legislature hasn't taken, or maybe that you want to reinforce and or improve to protect our migrant and immigrant communities?
Well, let me lay out the things that we know are possible just based on what we've seen other states across the country do.
Right.
We know about mask bans, something that Washington State passed, but are largely unenforceable. So a good step, but not by any means enough to protect families. 2, banning ICE from certain sensitive community spaces, things like courthouses, schools, daycare centers, without a judicial warrant. Again, something that the Washington State Legislature this past session took some steps on, but will continue to not protect people entirely because ICE with a judicial warrant can still get in there. Then there are some other things that, as part of the menu of things that we've seen other states tackle that I would really champion here in Washington, stripping incentives from companies that contract with ICE, basically making it more expensive or more costly for companies that right now make money from the destruction of families, the separation of families, and there's no world in which I'm willing to live with that. Also, several states have worked to create more pathways for people whose rights have been violated by ICE to sue, and that's something that, though, I would like to see Washington State take up more seriously. Giving people more recourse, basically. There's also, we have the opportunity to prohibit ICE from accessing our surveillance footage or forbidding local law enforcement from collaborating with ICE and turning over surveillance data to federal immigration authorities. These are all things that I think need to work together to deter ICE operations from tearing families apart and terrorizing immigrant families here in Washington. There's other things that didn't make it across the finish line this year that were briefly brought up as part of a conversation. Things like barring former ICE agents from being hired by state law enforcement. So again, disincentivizing working with or for ICE. I really think that, again, in the age of fascism, we need to do everything we
Right.
can possibly do to protect people from a completely lawless agency that has now become the biggest law enforcement agency in the country under Trump.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and then last but not least, before we say our goodbyes, is there anything else that you think voters in the 43rd should know about you?
Yeah, I think if I want to leave you with one thing, it's that you will always know where I stand and know that I'm going to the mat for the values of the most progressive district in the state. Without corporate PAC money at my back or corporate special interests in my ear. And the same cannot be said for the 20-year career politician that we're running against. We know that an affordable future is possible, but the politics as usual approach to governing that got us into the affordability crisis isn't going to get us out of it. And I, as a renter, a daughter of educators, someone whose work has been about taking on big fights with big corporations and winning alongside underpaid workers, we're running to offer the 43rd District a chance we haven't had in years to choose our fighter and elect a new generation of leadership we can trust. And that's what I would want to leave you with and voters of the 43rd to think about.
Awesome. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. Folks, this has been the pardon me. This has been the Unmasked Agenda. Wow, this is such a good interview. It made me cough a little. Okay, there we go. So this has been the 13th episode of the Unmasked Agenda for second season, and we are currently winding down. Next week, we should have a great conversation about housing, homelessness, and changing in that landscape. But Hannah, good luck to you, and we'll see you out there as you continue a campaign.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I'll see you on the campaign trail.
Peace.